KTU, Radio New York City. Come on down to Times Square.
Oh, now it...
Tonight, live at Irving Plaza, New Zealand's Group of the Year, Dalvanius and Patea Maori in concert with the Violent Femmes. And here's their latest hit single,
Hello.
Okay. Morena ki a tātou. Owen?
Kia ora tātou katoa. Now lawyers, please, could we have your undivided attention? Thank you. This morning our karakia matua, hirini, kingi o ngā kingi, tai mai ki te kia koe, nā, ka tukuna ka koe ngā te whakamui muti mō mātou ki te niata. Hoi anō e tātama, ka mihi.
A kia ora no tātou koto e te niata. No re te mātou te haerenga wā tātou kōro mo te ni rā kia sutuku hake tō tātou reo hakamuniti. Ko te mea tahi tūnono kia tau no te rangi māriatanga ki raro ki tēni tūnui. A tātou mene kia tātou kotoa ko tau mene ki roto. Ki tātou mei ko te tamā te rangi māria ki wanga ni te ni whakarite o mātou. I whakau mai o nei te māramatanga i te oro i te kahai te rangi māriatanga. Ko koe tūnuni e no tō mātou kai arahi kai āpina mai. E whiwhi e mātou ki roto ki ngā huapai o te oronga tina na me te oronga wairua. Mo ngā wā katoa ke imu ke ia mātou aini ake ai. Tō tātou himene tamanga kau Māori.
O Māori e tāma te atua te re tonu mātou aroai nā mai
Tamanga kau Māria. Tamanga kau Māria. Tama te atua. Te me tonu mātou. Kei nui tātou. E te tamā te rangi Māria, tēnei mātou au whanua ki te whakamine tono ki mua ki a koe roto i tēnei rā. Kia tau ho au manaakitanga ki runga ki a mātou. I roto i wā mātou mahi mō tēnei rā, i roto i wā manaakitanga. Nō reira ka ini atu ki a koe, kia manaakitia mai mātou e koe mai te tīmatatanga taino i tōna mutunga. We ni kotoa inu i te atana, i rungāni te tukunga mai o tau arohonoa. E te matu e te tama e te wairo tapu, o koe tununi anō e te tamata o mātu kai whakora i ake ai. Ai, kia ora tātou.
There's two pānuis here today, ladies and gentlemen. One was yesterday, someone lost some pink earphones. I think they call them the pink girls. So if you, by any chance, seem to kick it or slip over on it, please can you bring it up to the table and we'll return it to the owners. I want to make another pānui here. Usually I bring my taongos here, but what happens, someone stole my taongo o Wakanene from the whangaro papahapu when we finished. And it saddened my heart. I should be bitter, but I'm not. I'm a person now to just be able to forgive those people that did it. And just, it's a spiritual connection that had been ripped from me and my people. But I ask for the blessings of God on those people that done this. But if I may feel free, I want to judge as a quote from Abraham Lincoln. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy past. The occasion is piled high with high difficulty, and we rise with the occasion as our case is new. So we think anew and we act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves and then we shall save our country. All our ideas are enthralled, to which we take for granted. Abraham Lincoln in 1862. Thank you, Judge.
Tēnā koe, kia ora Owen. Tēnā koe matua, mo ena whakamoemiti. Tātou whakaritenga mo te rangi nei. Kia tau mai ngā manaakitanga katoa o te rungarawa ki rungi a tātou kia pahere tā tātaura. Nō reira ka nui te mihi ki a koe. Ngā tautoko au e nā whakamoemiti whakawhetai ki te rungarawa nā tātou e arahi mo te rangi nei. O tira kia ora no tātou, tātou e piri nei, mo tēnei kaupapa e whakapiri nei a tātou. Hoi anō. Mr. Hill, we will... Oh, any matters before...
Tēnā koe, te rangatira, anei a Awhiaki e inoi atu ki a
I was just going to ask Mr. Hill if he's got any timetable issues first, Mr. Awhiaki.
Just one, sir. We thought after Mr. Hill finishes issue 6, we would revert to the timetable as it was, and so we'll follow on with issue 7.
So we'll go to issue 7 and then issue 8.
Okay.
Ka pai. Council?
Koe anake, te rangatira e tū mai a Awhiaki tēnei. Tautoko i te whakamoemiti mai a Hirini. Tino moke hau ki te pauaka i te rangi nei, kare konei a rangi makawi. No reira moe mai rā, mohi ana ko ngā mihi kua mihia e tautoko ana ki tēnā. A huri no tō tātou whare ngā pohi e te tēpu. Kia ora mai.
Kia ora. Mr. Hill. We were at issue 6 and Dr. Anderson has some questions for you.
Morning, Mr. Hill. I've just got a couple of questions about, firstly about tāmana. And we were talking about whether those payments might be void. And I'd just like to bring to your attention that there are a number of instances where those payments that were made to individuals weren't found in the title, but the price, that money was deducted from the actual price that was finally paid out. And I wondered whether you had a comment on the fairness of that.
I would need to look at the cases that you're pointing to. I mean, certainly the understanding, my understanding of quite a few of the advance payments that were given by purchase officers was that it would be deducted from the ultimate purchase price, that it would be distributed by the rangatira to other members of the community, but that, yes, it would be ultimately form part of the purchase price.
Yes, but it should actually go, is it fair if it goes to people who weren't found to be owners and yet it's still taken off the purchase price?
Again, I would have to look at those cases and the circumstances of the award and the ultimate list of owners that was prepared in order to give a meaningful comment.
Well, I would refer you to document AA52 by Mr. Armstrong.
Yes, and I think there was a similar question on issue 5 on the role of Crown purchasers in various native land court proceedings and titling that you had asked that I'd said I would deal with in writing. Perhaps I can address this as well.
See, another issue I have is that you keep bringing up Pākānai as an example, and yet people at the time, and what you're arguing is, well, here's an example of things being planned and it working well, and you know, an agency on the part of Māori that they get together and discuss it, and they kind of decide which blocks are going to go and which are going to be retained. But when people at the time, including Pākehā, like people like Judge Manning, when he talked about tāmana, and criticised it, he didn't see it as planned. Often this statement is made that money was scattered like grain before the fowl. And so that evidence would suggest that taumana wasn't such a planned process.
And I think the reactions of Native Minister McLean and the directions that he issued to purchasing officers throughout the country, and particular disciplinary action he took against purchasing officers in the north, shows that there were problems with how it was being distributed. Yes. I would caution about Judge Manning's characterization of Crown purchasing activities, given that I think I've reproduced some of his views.
Yes.
And in the submissions, and he was highly critical of the collaboration between purchasing officers and the rangatira, and the exercise of chiefly authority in decision-making around bringing things before the court. I think at one point he describes it as a few rangatira sharks undermining the will of the people. So again, you have this tension between a court that's deferential to community decision-making and the political and cultural arrangements which Mr. Waltzel describes that were in accordance with tikanga, and some, like Judge Manning, who were skeptical about that decision-making. And so, again, we have that uncomfortable tension.
We do, and you know, I think historians recognise that, but we also come back to the framework in which they're operating and the amount of protection that is given to both rangatira and to the hapu, and whether that was satisfactory on both sides. I just have another comment, and it goes back to what I was talking to Mr. Irwin about, and the lack of documentation and the position that this puts us in, or the claimant researchers in, and us as a tribunal. And taumana is another example of this. And I just wonder if you're expecting standards of proof that are actually capable of being met when you ask for everything to be done by case. And it occurred to me last night, if the shoe was on the other foot and we were asking the Crown to prove that they had rightful title case by case, and to show that the right people were paid, that the money was fairly distributed, and that people understood, and that the boundaries were properly marked, wouldn't the Crown be in the same position of finding it very difficult to prove, partly because the documentation doesn't actually exist? And sometimes that's because of circumstance beyond the Crown's control, but sometimes it's because of the shortcomings in the process in the first place.
And I was thinking, as you were discussing that with Mr. Irwin, that one of the innovations in the Native Land Court process was to provide a court of record that, at least at the very minimum, was able to generate minute books and records of proceedings, records of objections, records of people attending and disputing the claims of others. So, I mean, we do have quite extensive records of block alienations and the proceedings before them. I think the difficulty, I would agree, is the problem of negative proof, or proving a negative around people who supposedly didn't attend, didn't object, but were nevertheless owners who were disenfranchised. It's just very difficult as the Crown to respond to that. I mean, given the fact that there was a court of record that could register all objections and develop a written record for posterity of those objections, we rely on that.
Isn't it especially difficult when so much of what's happening is outside the court, often with the Crown Purchase Officer involved, but not actually keeping a record of what's happening there?
I mean, that continues to this day. That's the nature of a legal proceeding. External processes are covered by settlement privilege, and yes, it presents problems for historians and probably for commissions of inquiry looking deep into the past, but it reflected a deferential approach to community decision making and a view that searching, contested, inquisitorial approaches to these proceedings would actually undermine community decision making and foment conflict. And there's criticism of the actions of, say, Judge Manning in doing just that.
But we don't always, you were saying it's community decision making, but we come back to that concept of the rangatira shark as well, don't we? Where we don't know necessarily whether there is a meeting. Sometimes there is, but often the accusation is that payments are being made in secret, not in the light of day, not on the land. And that payments are being made even in those community situations where they're on undefined blocks of land without reserves having been set aside, so people are being locked into transactions without really fully informed consent.
And I think if that is the case, then there's, in a particular block proceeding, then there is a problem. I think the Crown's position is, though, that the use of advance payments was for a particularly bracketed period of time in the 1870s, was discontinued in 1879, and granted quite a bit of land passed through the court during that period, but it would be, the Crown submits that you can't categorically condemn the offer and receipt of payment in advance for land.
Doesn't the problem kind of continue even after the court has given title when payments are being made to individuals on undefined interests within blocks?
I think that's a different problem, that is an actual acquisition of an interest that may not be defined by way of survey and partitioned out, but it's a cognizable interest in the land at that point. It's titled land, there are given shares, and the Crown is acquiring them. I think it presents problems that are dealt with in the Crown's concession around fragmentation, fractionalization, and the proneness that leaves land to alienation.
Yes.
And that Crown purchasing after the 1880s is very much focused on acquiring those interests, and the fractionalization of land makes that more possible.
And do you think adding to that problem is the capacity for the Crown to then lock those purchases in and keep private competition out?
But that doesn't appear to be the case. The swing in the 1890s and decisively at the beginning of the 20th century is toward private purchasing. That private purchasing absolutely eclipses Crown purchasing in that period. So to say that would be to go against the evidence.
But the Crown has that capacity from 1877 onwards, doesn't it?
To proclaim land
as being under negotiation.
Yes, and that does happen with respect to a few particular blocks, but that's not a general preemptive power. That's the acquisition. Well, I think generally speaking, private purchase is quite alive in the 1890s and the 1900s, with a few exceptions where the Crown has proclaimed something under negotiation and excluded the ability for private purchasers to acquire.
Right, and I just wanted to talk briefly about the question of fairness of price. And it seems to me often that your argument is that that price on that block was fair because all those other blocks were of a similar price. But isn't the problem that all Māori land is being undervalued? And so that's not really a very adequate defence.
The question becomes, though, since land has no inherent value, no market price that's available with but for reference to other pieces of comparable land, and but for reference to the immediate use that it can be put to, how do we arrive, or how in the 1870s was a purchasing officer to arrive at a market price, or the valuation, or sorry, the Department of Surveys, or the...
Dr. Loveridge did a report on valuation and he found that in 1905, that when a minimum price was set for Māori land, that the price that was being paid for Māori land rose quite markedly. And so wouldn't that suggest that in general Māori land was being undervalued before that point?
It may. It may also show, for instance, no, I'll leave it. It may show that. I would have to look at that.
All right, well, thank you. Those are all my questions for now.
Good morning, Mr. Hill.
Good morning.
Just on that same point, really, pardon me, about price paid. You refer on page, or around page 31, to the value or estimate of timber on Puhi Puhi and what was actually paid.
Yes.
And the question really in respect of that is, was there no consideration given by the Crown to a policy for valuing timber of that quality with costs of extraction perhaps subtracted, so that the owners could have received something again approaching the value of what was a key resource on that land, even if it's not a total market value?
I'm not aware of a policy per se. There certainly was a practice for offering increased values or increased prices for areas with standing timber and kauri in particular. But I don't know that there was an actual actuarial exercise looking into the cost of extraction, infrastructure development, and so on. I think the point there, though, is that the bare market price that's put forward as the true value of the Puhi Puhi blocks, Mr. Darby agrees, didn't take into account all of the things that the Crown would have to do in order to develop the land so that it could be used for forestry, so that you can't simply take the market price of a developed piece of land that's ready for use.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. We're done with issue 6, I think. We'll move to issue 7.
So I'll also be presenting the Crown submissions on issue 7, 20th century Māori land development and administration, and that's document 3.3.414.
Just give us a sec to change folders and all the rest of it. All right. You got all this stuff? All right. Thank you.
So this is a lengthy submission, and what I will do is go through some of the introduction in some detail, and then have the figures taken as read around the extent of alienation, then discuss some of the approaches to addressing issues with Māori land tenure in more detail, but with a real focus on the 1930s and onwards with consolidation and land development. Now, starting at page 3, at the beginning of the 20th century, Māori and Whangarei, Whangaroa, Hokianga and the Bay of Islands still owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land. However, owing to various factors, including land purchases, succession rules, and population growth, much of this land was highly fractionalized and was difficult to put to economic uses. Changes in Northland Māori society and the changing expectations of individuals and families led them to partition the land to better define their interests in it. This ultimately hampered the ability of communities to make collective decisions about land use, and with the changing economics of farming, these smaller blocks became harder to farm in a way that could support everyone. Moreover, many of the protective aspects of Māori land tenure and administration created barriers to development, limiting access to finance and impeding decision-making. In the following...
Oh, sorry, Mr. Hill, can I interrupt you there?
Absolutely.
Because what I've put in my margin note there and is that a treaty breach on the part of the Crown?
I think it flows from the conceded breach in issue 5, that these are the results, these are the knock-on effects described in that concession, the effects of fractionalization, fragmentation, partitioning, and the difficulties around collectively making decisions in the absence of statutory forms of collective title and decision-making.
Yes, thank you. And would you add into that excessive Crown purchasing?
The one concession that I didn't get to in issue 6, because it was taken as read, is that the Crown did not have a policy in the 19th century around ensuring that it did not purchase too much land, that it did not purchase excessive land, and I can take you to that if that would assist.
Oh, no, that's fine, thank you.
In the following decades, the Crown introduced policies for Māori land that were intended to encourage access to finance and enable better administration by overcoming some of the difficulties with fractionalized title. These included vesting of land in Māori land councils under the Māori Land Administration Act of 1900, the creation of Māori land boards under the Māori Land Settlement Act of 1905, the introduction of consolidation schemes, land development schemes, title reform under the Māori Affairs Act 1953, and legislation relating to incorporations, trusts, and amalgamations of land. Now, these reforms were intended to promote better utilization of Māori lands in order to provide a sustainable economic base for Northland Māori. Regrettably, some of the efforts had unintended and opposite effects. Whether they amount to...
Sorry, Mr. Hill. Isn't it also the fact, though, that these policies, when you talk about utilisation, you're actually talking about facilitating sale to Pākehā?
And I will deal with that in the vesting schemes, but I think certainly with consolidation and development schemes, that was not the case. And with vesting, we'll look at some of the total figures that were found by the Commission of Inquiry in 1951, and in fact, a significant portion of the lands vested were delayed.
Sorry, vested in whom?
In the Tokoro District Māori Land Board.
Yes. Were what? Sorry?
Were not sold and were at least delayed in any type of permanent alienation well into the 20th century, perhaps by virtue of vesting. And we'll get to that.
All right, thank you.
Now, whether they amount to, and that's these reforms, whether they amount to a breach of the treaty and its principles requires a careful analysis of the circumstances, the Crown's intentions, and its knowledge of the effects. Some initiatives, like compulsory vesting of Māori lands and the compulsory acquisition of uneconomic interests, the Crown has conceded were inconsistent with the treaty. Others, such as consolidation and land development schemes, the Crown maintains were good faith efforts to assist Northland Māori in developing the productivity of their lands and providing much needed rural employment. The claimants allege that development schemes were in breach of the treaty in that they deprived Northland Māori of the use of their lands and encumbered them with debt, while all along the Crown purchased interests in them. The claimants say the true purpose behind them was Crown control of Māori land, not assisting Māori in utilizing it. Now, while the Crown acknowledges that development schemes ultimately failed to produce the robust rural employment for Northland Māori that Sir Apirananata and other proponents had envisioned, the Crown notes that the vision of land development as a source of long-term prosperity for Northland Māori was not attainable, regardless of what the Crown did or did not do. This had more to do with demographic change and changes in the nature of farming and farm labor than the operation of the development schemes themselves. And here I refer to Nicholas Bailey's report commissioned by the Tribunal on aspects of economic development in Northland. And in his report, he describes how commercial farming had come to rely on less and less labor and was a diminishing source of rural employment throughout the 20th century. And I quote at paragraph 7, "Farming in New Zealand has been essentially capital intensive, not employing large numbers of people directly. Whether breaking in land, farming it subsequently, efficient commercial agriculture required a limited set of skilled and unskilled labor to be productive. Even if Māori farming had been remarkably successful after development scheme assistance, it could never have satisfactorily addressed the employment needs of Te Raki Māori." Another quote, "Te Raki Māori farming and indeed general Māori agricultural commercial activity faced serious obstacles to profitable or even sustainable returns. The region provided no genuine alternatives to Māori economic development apart from commercial land use." And we'll discuss that more in issue 12 submissions. "Even if Māori land use options had been less constrained by legislative and administrative formalities and had become even more profitable, there was still a further and growing challenge of finding sufficient employment for the growing population, as farming and generally commercial land use activities were not labor intensive." Now, this was particularly problematic given how rural the Northland Maori population was for most of the 20th century. In 1958, Northland Maori were far more rural than their Pakeha counterparts. One study showed that 83% of Northland Maori lived outside of boroughs as opposed to 57% of Pakeha. Now, much of the land within the development schemes came from the Crown. When the drawbacks of the development schemes became clear, the Crown was willing to write off millions of dollars in debts that had accrued against the land. It also revested the shares it had acquired in the owners and the Maori trustee. In short, the Crown did not come away from the development schemes with any net gain in lands or funds. In fact, it incurred substantial losses. Today, Maori incorporations and trusts offer a way to administer land collectively, overcoming some of the barriers.
Sorry, Mr. Hill,
yes.
In terms of, what's the reference in terms of the evidence we have about the Crown incurring substantial losses with these development schemes?
Yes, and I'll come to that. That's in the answers to written questions by Heather Bassett. I believe it's A10D. Now, most Maori land in Northland is currently administered by one or the other. At the same time, Te Tura Whenua Maori Act 1993 offers substantial protections for Maori land ownership, including recognition of land as
And just on that one,
Yes.
Mr. Hill, because later on you do talk about the incorporations and the trust, but when you refer to most, I couldn't find what most means. Is that?
most land, you mean?
Yes.
That's
under administration of either a trust or an incorporation. What's the percentage?
The percentages are provided in those sections as at 2008. If you take the two figures, the one I
There's one for incorporations, but I didn't see one for
trust.
trust.
I'll provide you that reference now. It's at the end of paragraph 203. By 2008, there were 517 trusts managing 53,454 hectares, 132,000 acres. And if you add that to the amount being...
Incorporations is noted at 198. Thank you.
Yes. However, as this tribunal recently found, these protective measures have also provoked a series of calls within Maoridom for reform to better permit the utilization and development of Maori land. As such, Maori land tenure and its attempt to balance retention and utilization remains a difficult challenge in the modern day. And I'm at paragraph 11 here. In 2015, the Te Tai Tokoro Northland Growth Study revealed some positive trends and outcomes for Northland Maori. And granted, some of these figures will include land and resources outside of the inquiry district, but I think they're illustrative. Maori are significant participants in Northland farming and forestry. Northland Maori hold almost 140,000 hectares, or over 340,000 acres of Maori land. This does not include general land held by Northland Maori. Self-employed Maori, Maori employers, and land-owning trusts and incorporations in Northland hold a total of $2.4 billion in assets, and Maori businesses account for $730 million of value added, or 13% of the total value added of all of Northland. Now, the Crown acknowledges that under Article 2 of the treaty, it has a general obligation to take reasonable steps to protect the land and resources of Maori for as long as they wish to retain them. The Crown also accepts that throughout the 20th century, it was in the position of a privileged purchaser, and this imposed significant obligations for the Crown to apply high standards of good faith and fair dealing. The Crown maintains, however, that the ability to alienate land, and we discussed this in issue 5, is a fundamental right of ownership under both Articles 2 and 3. If the Crown were to have completely restrained the ability of Northland Māori to alienate their land, that would also be inconsistent with the treaty. As such, there is a tension between establishing safeguards to ensure the retention of Māori land and enabling owners to utilize and, if necessary, alienate it. Therefore, assessing the Crown's duty to protect Māori ownership of land is context-specific. As we outlined below, the Crown concedes...
Sorry, Mr. Hill, when you say context-specific, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
As opposed to the alienability of land being categorically in breach of the treaty.
So we're back to this case-by-case phrase that you...
Yes.
Okay. And I just... fundamental to that tension, and one of the things we have to keep in mind all the time, is who is actually making these laws and who is controlling this process, isn't it? I mean, that's the nub of the matter, that it's not Māori who are doing it. They're not coming up with these rules.
I think we'd have to look at how the rules and proposals were actually arrived at.
Yes.
And I would, again, commend to you, like as we're going to start with the Māori Land Administration Act, we have an act that was a political compromise, not just between Māori and the Crown, but as among different sectors of Māoridom who had competing views about what the future of Māori land administration would be. Moreover, the Stout Ngata Commission is headed by Surapirana Ngata, who had his own visions of Māori land use. The consolidation and development schemes, again, are ideas from Surapirana Ngata that were warmly endorsed and encouraged in Northland and by Northland Māori, including the Northland Māori MPs. So I'd be careful I'd caution the tribunal in adopting a binary or oppositional approach. Certainly these reforms, these proposals weren't developed by the Crown or imposed by the Crown unilaterally.
The start... I'm sorry.
I was actually going to ask about the Māori Land Administration Act, because you talked about that process of compromise in terms of the Māori councils, but you haven't really talked about what that compromise was in terms of this act.
And that's true. And as I was reviewing my submissions, I recognized that I hadn't dealt with the decade leading up to the introduction of that act. And I would commend to you Dr. Loveridge's report, which covers that in significant detail, including the various positions that were taken by different parties and the various iterations and proposed compromises that led towards the Māori Land Administration Act. Unfortunately, I haven't reproduced that in my submission.
And I suppose my reaction to what you have said about Māori being involved, it is always, isn't it, from a minority position.
Within Parliament, or?
Well, including within Parliament.
Yes, numerically, Māori in Parliament were a minority. However, as the circumstances leading up to the Māori Land Administration Act showed, they often held the balance of power, and that was true in the late 19th century, as well as in the early 19th century with Tau Henare, whose support was required for the Massey government. The minority position within Parliament could, as it does today, hold a decisive influence on which party ultimately takes control of government.
But aren't we looking at a situation where, in fact, these issues concern Māori? It's about Māori land and how you control Māori land, and yet their voice is only a small voice within the power structure, unless circumstances give them, in a particular election situation, the balance of power.
Yes, and I think the Crown, certainly the developments after 1900, and for instance the introduction of the Native Land Settlements Act in 1907 shows that yes, Parliament at that time could act with sufficient support relatively unilaterally. And the Crown has conceded that in that case where compulsory vesting was introduced under that act and its predecessor act, the 1905 Act, that was inconsistent with the treaty and its principles. However, I don't think the mere fact, and again this goes back to my submissions or our submissions on issue 5, the mere fact of the Crown legislating with respect to Māori land is consistent with the Article 1 powers of kawanatanga. And I think that's accepted in large part by the claimants in their acceptance of the 1862 Act and various other aspects of Māori land reform. The question is whether it's truly responsive to the needs, desires, and what's being requested by Māori.
I think that's one aspect of it, but the other aspect of it is there's a systemic problem in that the Māori voice doesn't have, the Māori wishes don't have the political power that you might argue under the treaty should have been catered for right from the word go.
And again, this is going back to, I suppose, the most important issue in this inquiry, issue 1, and yes, the balance of kawanatanga and tino rangatiratanga as it's evolved over the course of the last 170 years. I don't propose to be able to answer that question in these submissions, but I take your point.
All right, thank you.
Kia ora, Mr. Hill. Just on that point as well, I was just going to observe that the Stark Ngāta Commission, which of course was charged with investigating how much land Māori might be able to alienate in 1907-8 because they weren't using it, Ngāta and Stout write towards the beginning of their work that it should be remembered that this is not just about individual alienation, because tribal land or Māori land was impressed with a tribal trust, and it was different because tribal communities were involved, and in particular there was an obligation that the Crown should also take into account to preserve land tribally for the next generations, and simply not to be concerned with how much land people might need at the very beginning of the 20th century, which perhaps is a very useful caution.
And I think one thing that I haven't dealt with in these submissions, but I believe is touched on in some of the evidence, is that the Stout Ngāta Commission, I mean, it's often seen as hand in glove with the vesting process, but it was meeting with and consulting with those communities around what lands they wished to retain, what lands they believed were surplus and could be leased or sold. And again, I would go to the point that I hope to reach in my submissions, that by 1951, although the Crown has conceded that the compulsory aspect of vesting was inconsistent with the treaty and a breach of its principles, it does appear to have kept a significant portion of lands from being permanently alienated well into the 20th century. And if you look at the pace of alienation at the beginning of the 20th century, I think that bears that out.
Yes, and that particular purpose of the Stout Ngata Commission, of course, to look at how much could be leased and how much sold, and it's quite clear the government wanted a lot to appear in the sold column, but Ngata, in fact, did his best to try and persuade the government that, in fact, there wasn't heaps of land available that could be sold. That itself was a reflection of the enormous preoccupation of the government at the beginning of the century with not having unused Māori land, despite the amount of alienation across the country that had taken place.
And I think that needs to be viewed, if you look at Ngata's statements, that has to be viewed both from a Crown view of wanting to open land to settlement and development for the overall good of the nation, but also the complaints by Māori landowners about inability to access finance, inability to develop lands, the reluctance of any private banks to actually provide financing. These were perhaps by modern standards misguided attempts to address those issues, but they were not just responsive to the desire to develop land for the country more generally, but an attempt to respond to the concerns of Māori particularly.
Yes, to some extent that's true, I think.
Now, the Crown has conceded in this inquiry that, and I've alluded to this, the compulsory vesting of land in the Tokoro Māori Land Board between 1907 and 1909 without owner consent breached the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles and effectively alienated owners from those lands for over 50 years. And when Hapu did regain control of their land, it often had large debts and owners were liable for compensating lessees for improvements. The Crown concedes that was a breach of the treaty. The Crown also concedes that in circumstances where proclamations were continually rolled over, so this is the monopoly power that you were referring to, Dr. Anderson, and owners had manifested no wish to enter negotiations, and owners lost opportunities as a result, it cannot be said that the Crown acted consistently with its duty to purchase reasonably and regulate processes appropriately. The unreasonable and unfair use of this power was a breach of the Treaty of Waitangi. Moreover, the Crown concedes that the Crown promoted legislation that empowered the Māori trustee between 1953 and 1974 to compulsorily acquire a number of Māori land interests in the district which the Crown deemed uneconomic. The Crown concedes that where this occurred, it caused Māori to lose their turanga waiwai, and this form of compulsory acquisition was a breach of the treaty and its principles. And the Crown has also made a specific breach acknowledgement with respect to the Takarai block in northern Hokianga, which was compulsorily vested in the Tokoro Māori Land Board in 1907, so it could be leased for development but remain in Māori ownership. It purchased a large portion of Takarai to help lessees freehold land they were otherwise prohibited from purchasing directly, and its purchase of large proportion of Takarai in these circumstances was a breach of the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles. Now, the claimants say these concessions do not go far enough. The Crown's policies were, quote, cloaked with good intentions, end quote, but were ultimately aimed at acquiring more land and obtaining financial benefits. The claimants say that despite, quote, the Crown's purported intent to assist Māori to retain and develop their land, end quote, the Crown nevertheless breached the treaty. Consolidation and land development schemes are singled out as breaches of the treaty, which the Crown has yet to concede. The claimants cite lack of consultation on the implementation of these schemes, dominance by Crown officials, debt, land loss, and the ultimate failure of the schemes as reasons for this. On page 9, the Crown's response. The Crown does not concede that the consolidation and development schemes were inconsistent with the treaty. To the contrary, they were a good faith effort to assist Northland Māori to develop and retain their land. And I've gone through at paragraph 18 previous findings of the tribunal to that effect. Paragraph 19, although many of the development schemes were unsuccessful in producing economic farms and sustainable rural employment, the Crown was willing to write off millions of dollars of debt that had been charged against those schemes and ultimately revested all of the interests it had acquired in the owners and the Māori trustee. The failure to provide rural employment was part of a wider economic transition as farming became capital and less labor intensive. There's little the Crown could do to influence that shift or the urban drift that it entailed, and that will be addressed in more detail in the issue 12 submissions. Now I'll take as read the next section, which begins on page 10, but I would point out at paragraph 22, Dr. Terry Hearn's report notes that just over 32,000 acres of Māori land was purchased by the Crown between 1909 and 1945 in the Northland District. So indeed, in the 20th century, private purchasing in the Northland District well surpassed Crown purchasing. And the patterns of that purchasing are described in more detail and figures given in those sections. I would also point out at paragraph 33 that purchase and sale of Māori land did not invariably mean that land was leaving Māori ownership. The evidence shows that Māori were themselves active buyers of Māori land. The Pakenai 2 block is a prime example. In 1889, the block was partitioned into 82 numbered sections. Ms. Coralie Clarkson was cross-examined on the subsequent purchase and sale of interests within that block. And I have an excerpt from the cross-examination there. Question, at table 14, you have a chart where you listed the sales of Pakenai lands from 1909 to 1953. Answer, yes. And here you can see multiple sales in the Pakenai 2 block in particular. Yes. And I'm right that the purchasers are mostly tangata whenua. Yes, it appears there were a number of land sales sort of between families and so forth. And then at the bottom, the sixth line from the bottom, question, and here you have table 19, which is sales after 1953. Answer, yes. And again, the purchases listed here are generally tangata whenua, some with interests in that block. Yes, certainly the purchaser H. Hemara and P. Clarisic, those are names that are on ownership lists for other blocks in the Pakenai area. Question, so by no means were all the sales to outsiders after purchase? Answer, no. As you can see, there were sales going on between families and between people who were living in the area.
Can I just stop you there, Mr. Hill? And just backtrack, I just want to be clear, when you say, well, there wasn't much Crown purchasing, but there was a lot of private purchasing, you're not suggesting that that means that the Crown has no responsibility within that process?
No, I'm not. The Crown is responsible for setting the overall framework of the land laws, which provide safeguards or protective measures against alienation, yes. And certainly to any extent the Crown facilitated that or landlessness that resulted from that through compulsory vesting or through the operation of the land boards, the Crown would be responsible for that.
All right, thank you. And the other point, I suppose, is you have to assess those figures in the fact that the Māori land base is already much reduced.
Yes, of course.
All right, thank you.
In fact, the Crown had greatly assisted the entrance of private purchasers back into the market in the 1909 Native Land Act, and the various systems which assisted those purchasers to deal with Māori for the purchase of their land.
Yes, and the one thing I would note is, I believe, Dr. Anderson, you asked a question, or perhaps it was Dr. Parsonson, about the issue of the Crown excluding or forcing private purchasers out of the market. Of course, there were issues with the Crown being the primary purchaser, in part because it created problems in arriving at a true market price. With fewer people participating in the market, the Crown was able to, as we discussed earlier, acquire lands at a lower price. So private purchasing, and private purchasing being the dominant form of purchasing, was desirable at the end of the 19th century and was desired by Māori because it would mean an overall rise in prices. Now, that doesn't mean that the overall extent of private purchasing at the beginning of the 20th century is completely defensible. My point is that private purchasing eclipsing Crown purchasing was an important development and one that had been sought in the past.
Yes, and you've just reminded me that one of the themes, in fact, in that discussion officially through much of the latter part of the 19th century was why shouldn't Māori auction their land so that they could, in fact, really get a market price. And I think it was finally enacted about 1893, but that act never came into force, so it didn't happen.
You also see petitions and correspondence from Honeheke Napua saying that perhaps all Māori land should be simply treated as general land so that Māori can receive a true market price for their land. So those ideas were being floated as well.
Yes.
Now, I'm at page 15. Land tenure reform in the 19th century made economic development of lands in Northland in the 20th century very difficult. Multiply owned Māori land was subject to various legislative protections, while interest in it had become increasingly fractionalized and fragmented through partition and succession. And as a result, private banks were extremely reluctant to lend money for the development of land in multiple ownership. Sorapi Rananata discussed some of the barriers faced by Māori in developing their land at the beginning of the 20th century. Quote, until the second decade of the present century, the attempts to assist Māoris to farm their land were sporadic and hesitating. Where the individual had been fortunate enough to obtain a freehold title to valuable land, he was permitted to raise money upon mortgage, a very costly proceeding because of the safeguards and restrictions imposed by the legislature, which regarded less the needs of the would-be Māori farmer than the supposed machinations and designing moneylender. The mortgage was suspected as another device to wrest his land from Māori. As Nata's observation shows, lack of access to finance was a crucial barrier for developing multiply owned Māori land. Lenders were unwilling to provide credit against secured Māori land with its safeguards and restrictions against alienation, many of which had been introduced to prevent further land loss. Nata also suggested that there was a suspicion among Māori that mortgages were another device to obtain the land. There was some government support for providing financing for land development, in particular the scheme to provide low-interest loans under the Advances to Settlers Act, 1894. Now, there's very little evidence on this act in this inquiry, but the Crown submits that loans under the Advances to Settlers scheme were available to Māori. According to Dr. Donald Loveridge's evidence in the Te Rohepotai inquiry, quote, there was nothing in the legislation itself to prevent Māori from applying for or receiving advances to settlers' loans, and some did. The Crown is unaware of any evidence on the uptake by Northland Māori or of Northland Māori being refused loans under the scheme. However, there were multiple amendments to that scheme in order to better facilitate Māori access to it. The Crown acknowledges that at a national level, the value of the loans dispersed to Māori was a small fraction of the overall scheme, perhaps 1%. But there's little evidence, as I've said, about its operation in this district, and I believe Mrs. Armstrong and Subasic simply dismiss it as unavailable statutorily to Māori, and I believe that's incorrect. Now, as discussed in the submissions on issue 5 and 6, the Crown has conceded that the operation and impact of the native land laws and the individualization of title under them made Northland Māori lands more susceptible to partition, fragmentation, and alienation, and that this in turn undermined tribal structures of authority and was inconsistent with the Crown's duty of active protection. But the Crown would also submit that by the 20th century, partition often reflected the wishes of Northland Māori communities and was a consequence of social change within them, not simply the cause. And I'll turn to page 17. David Armstrong was cross-examined about the partition of the Maroata blocks by Ngāti Hau in 1895 and 1903. And in the interest of time, I won't repeat that. However, at the end of that section, and I believe earlier in the cross-examination, Mr. Armstrong agrees that part of the change is a change in the influence, that Ngāti Hau tribal dynamics had changed, and that the decision to partition was in a way a consequence as opposed to a cause of that change in tribal dynamic. The Crown submits that this evidence shows how the process of partition and fragmentation was spurred, at least in part, by changes within Northland Māori society and the desire of individuals and whānau to define their interests in land. And that's shown also in the cross-examination of Miss Coralie Clarkson, where it was found the lack of defined interests prior to surveying partition had created problems for leasing and sale of land, and there were difficulties with the undefined interests and a desire to better define them where you had people living in close proximity to one another.
So you're saying that Māori had moved away from the collective title, communal title model and now had been colonised to an extent where individual title was their preferred title.
I'm not saying that. Mr. Armstrong and Ms. Coralie Clarkson were acknowledging that there had been that transformation. Now, it's a result of what the Crown concedes is a treaty breach, but nevertheless, there are questions about the availability of partition and the desirability of partition in the 20th century. I think what this shows is that it was desired by particular individuals and whānau. And I would also say the issues around amalgamated blocks today and the desire to repartition them into whānau blocks and individual interests also shows that there's an ongoing interest to have defined individual and family allotments and interests in land.
That's one way of looking at it, although the other way is that, yes, the system of the Native Land Court did very well in its colonising operation.
And again, I would submit that that's a flow-on effect from what the Crown has conceded is a breach in ultimately undermining tribal authority. Now, I'm running out of time, so I will actually propose to take the following section on the Māori Land Administration Act and vesting as read, because of course the Crown has conceded that compulsory vesting was a breach of the treaty. The submission I would make, and I believe I've made it multiple times already, is that the initial system that was set up in the Māori Land Administration Act was a response to the desires within Māoridom both to be involved in title determinations and to have better administration of land. Ultimately, however, it did result in compulsory vesting of land that removed land from the access and use of Māori for 50 years. The one other point I'd make before I leave that section, which only because I've alluded to it, I would take you to paragraph 80. Dr. Hearn records the following figures for overall vesting in the Takaro Māori Land Board. Quote, the 1951 Royal Commission recorded that of a grand total of 219,224 acres vested in the Takaro Māori Land Board, 29,690 acres had been sold to the Crown, 18,727 acres had been sold to private individuals, 30,790 acres had been leased, and 31,106 acres had been revested. Now, of course, these figures include lands outside of the inquiry district, and Dr. Hearn concludes that they show that much of the land vested in the land board was left idle. However, the Crown submits that the figures also show that much of the vested land was retained and that permanent alienation was delayed well into the 20th century. And I would say two things in addition to that. If you look at the pace of private land sales at the very beginning of the 20th century, it's remarkable that this amount of land then was retained in Māori ownership to the 1950s. The other thing I would point out is that the original goal of the vesting schemes was to sell 50%, fully half of all the lands vested. And this is far less. Far less was ultimately sold. So I will now move to consolidation and development schemes, which is at page 31. Page 31, paragraph 85. In the 1920s, Ngāta proposed consolidation of titles as one solution to the issues with Māori tenure. As the name suggests, the goal was to consolidate the fragmented and dispersed interests of Māori landowners into contiguous blocks, which could then operate as single economic units. This would be achieved through the large-scale exchange of individual Māori interests in numerous partitions across adjacent blocks, amalgamating those interests, and then partitioning them out into a surveyed and individualized title. It was thought that this could overcome the fragmentation and fractionalization of interests and assist with the development of land. Ngāta's proposal was given effect through the Native Land Amendment and Native Land Claims Adjustment Act of 1923, and the Native Land Amendment and Native Land Claims Adjustment Act of 1927. Now, attempts to deal with the Northland situation through land consolidation date from 1927 in that latter act. The Native Land Consolidation Commission was set up, led by Ngāta, to promote land consolidation in Northland and some other North Island districts. An initial survey of the Northland district was made early in 1928. Now, the commission held a public meeting at Otiria in the Bay of Islands in February 1928. And according to the Northern Advocate, about 600 of the most influential chiefs and landowners from the North Auckland district were in attendance. According to the article, Ngāta, quote, expounded in detail the proposed scheme of consolidating the Maori lands, and the benefits to be derived by the Maoris therefrom. The proposal was thoroughly discussed before all the representatives present accepted the proposals as outlined. While the Otiria meeting was in session, the Commission met with the Bay of Islands County Council, and a rates compromise was arranged. The arrangement was approved by the Native Land Court. And when the Commission and the County Council appeared before the court, Tau Henare and Kakaporowini also appeared and gave evidence in support of the compromise. Henare and Porowini both said they spoke on behalf of the Maori people. In the case of the Kaikohe Town Board, the Northern Advocate reported that several of the large Maori landowners attended a meeting between the Commission and the Town Board. After Ngata had suggested a figure for the rate compromise, the Northern Advocate reported that the Maori present at the Town Board separately considered the matter before agreeing to the figure that Ngata had suggested. And there's some details of the other rates compromises in the following section.
Take a break and recognize it's all right.
Thank you. I'm falling apart here. Now, the Crown submits that what this shows was broad-based consultation. Indeed, Dr. Herndon concludes that Maori in the district largely welcomed the prospects which consolidation offered.
And that's not really very surprising, is it?
No.
Because of the solution to their dreadful title problems by this time, and also the fact that Ngata was tying it to the unpaid rates, the growing pressure from the county councils that Māori should pay rates, unpaid survey charges, all of those things. And Ngata was trying to find a solution that actually might deal with all of it.
Now I'll move to how the Northland consolidation schemes got underway at page 35. Northland was divided into 4 districts: Manganui, Bay of Islands, Hokianga, and Kaipara. The Bay of Islands and Hokianga consolidation districts are within the Northland Inquiry District, but only parts of Manganui and Kaipara schemes are included in this district. And just to give you a sense of the scale, because this becomes an issue, I've included the figures here. The Bay of Islands consolidation scheme was divided at its inception into 20 series, covering 2,909 blocks containing 208,674 acres, with 18,000 owners and 15,000 successor owners. The Hokianga consolidation scheme involved 2,900 blocks with 103,000 acres, 12,000 original owners, and 18,000 successor owners. And these figures are striking in themselves, but they were part of a wider Tokoro consolidation program which involved 6,583 blocks and 42,000 original owners. Now, the massive scale of the schemes, along with the economic contraction during the 1930s, slowed progress significantly. Ngata described some of the difficulties inherent in land consolidation in a 1932 ministerial statement, where he said, "Titles were necessarily separate and distinct. The name of any one individual on the one hand, on the other hand, occur in the titles of many blocks, either as an original owner or by succession, and these blocks might be distributed over many counties. Again, the share of an individual or shares of himself, his wife, and family might be so small in each of these blocks as to render them useless unless they are sold or leased. The purpose of a consolidation scheme is to bring about the aggregation of these shares on a net value basis in localities suited to individuals or families, and so defined as to conform as far as possible to the requirements of modern settlement." Now, the more owners there were, the more difficult it would be to bring a scheme to completion. Moreover, the longer it took to complete a scheme, the more likely the arrangements would be further undermined by the appearance of new owners as the rules of succession operated. Now, the Claimants have criticized the Crown for the lack of success and the delay involved in the consolidation schemes. But the Crown submits that the Northland schemes were much more complex than elsewhere, given the multiplicity of interests. The first large-scale consolidation scheme was the Urewera scheme, launched in 1921. This scheme involved about 3,000 owners and 50 blocks of land. By contrast, the two main consolidation schemes in Northland, the Bay of Islands and Hokianga schemes, involved over 30,000 owners, and that's just original owners, and nearly 5,000 blocks of land. I think it's actually closer to 6.
Can I interrupt you, Mr. Hill? Because
Yes.
when I read that, I thought, well, what does that say about what's happened in Northland compared to the rest of the country? The conclusion I draw from that is that the impact of native land court is actually more dire in Northland than elsewhere in the country.
And the fact that it had been operating for longer, and all the way back to 1862.
Well, that's... I mean, I'd have to challenge you on that. Native Land Court started operating in many parts of the country, if not in 1862, certainly in 1865.
I think, again, we keep going back to the effects of individualization of title, and the fact that, yes, it appears in Northland, the fragmentation, fractionalization, and partitioning, and the resulting alienation from that was quite marked by the operation of the Native Land Court. And the Crown has, again, conceded that that initial act, the allowance for individualization, and the prejudice caused by its effects were breaches of the treaty.
All right, I just drew that to your attention because you keep asking us to look case by case, and I'm saying to you, when we look, here's an evidence in the overall that in fact the impact has been quite extreme.
And should not those numbers of owners and blocks have given the Crown pause, because they knew something by then of how consolidation worked and how very slow it was, and how very gruelling it was for Māori owners to go through that. So it's not surprising that the schemes were still unfinished nearly 20 years later. So should the Crown have paused before it embarked on such a massive scheme?
I would say that because of the involvement and the sort of the intertwined nature of consolidation and the development schemes, and the urgency at the end of the 1920s around providing rural employment and stimulating farming in the region with a worsening economic situation, meant that both Northland Māori